Hi everyone, welcome back to Rachel's Studio, and in today's tutorial I'm going to tell you all about one of my very favorite techniques that I use in almost every single one of my paintings. And this week I've been working on a zebra painting, and I'm going to cover a lot of ground in this video. Not only will I explain what charging is, but also tricks to improve your odds of success with it, the many different effects you can get with it, and how you can use charging in both small controlled areas like a zebra stripe and larger areas like a background, and even ways to use it for enhanced realism. Thank you so much to Jerry Mikolas on Pexels for this beautiful reference image. And I painted this zebra, and most of it was done with my charging method. So what is charging and how do you use it? Today I'll answer that question, so let's get right into it. First, I want to show you the paper I'm using to paint the zebra, because paper is the most important ingredient in a watercolor painting for most techniques, including charging. When I started this painting, I decided to make this a study with a very real possibility of painting it again. So I took it as an opportunity to try this new to me paper by Hippie Crafter, which they so generously sent to me to try. It is an extremely good value. I did the math and compared its price to my current favorite paper that I use for quote unquote serious work, which is Hahnemühle The Collection cold press paper, and found that for every one sheet of Hahnemühle I buy, I could buy 6 of this Hippie Crafter paper. This Hippie Crafter is still a cold press, acid-free watercolor paper. However, I don't believe it's 100% cotton paper, so it will be limited to withstand more vigorous scrubbing techniques. However, I was able to use a technique called carving with it, which will be the topic of next week's video, by the way, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the watercolor techniques that I'm going to be sharing in the next few weeks. I was very happy overall with this paper and will use it a lot for future studies and fun projects like Christmas cards and such. Before I started with the charging technique, I put in a first watch, which I'm sure I will cover in some future video. I show it to you here so that you understand that when you use the charging technique, you can do it on top of a previously painted layer that is fully dried. For almost all my watercolor paintings, I use several layers of different techniques to build up complexity of color, value, and form. But let's get to the good stuff, charging. Let me show you in a more simplified format exactly what charging is. First, you paint an area with clean, clear water. You paint the water wherever you want the paint to flow and leave the paper dry where you don't want your paint to go. So for example, in this painting of the zebra, all the white stripes were more or less kept completely dry throughout the painting. To use the method of charging, first you paint with clear water the area you want to paint. So here you see me getting the stripe I want to paint black with clear water first. I then get fairly thick paint and drop it into the wet area. The watercolor pigment just naturally spreads out across the wet area. And I also push it along with the brush, but because it's wet, it really allows the pigment to spread out evenly for fairly even color and value across the stripe. And that is why charging is such a useful technique. It is harder to get an area perfectly evenly black or whatever color you're using if you paint it on dry paper. You might end up with blotchy areas or some areas of the stripe lighter and some parts darker. But the laws of nature help here, and the pigment moves itself around so it evenly fills in the whole stripe to a certain extent, or whatever you might be painting. Basically, putting water down first helps everything look smooth and even and blend softly together. So even if you do have lighter and darker areas within the area you charged, they'll blend softly together and look very natural. And I'm going to show you how you can use this method to get soft graduated blends of color or gradations from light to dark. But now let's talk about the finer points of using charging to get all kinds of outcomes, and also a few tips to add to your success with this technique. When you paint on your clear water, don't paint a puddle like you see me doing here. When I try to add paint to it, the paint isn't very amenable to filling in the wet spot. If I get drippier paint, I'm able to get more pigment into this puddle, but one, it is pretty diluted, making it impossible to get dark enough, and two, when it dries, it will get a hard, darker, thin margin that usually is not what you want. When using charging, try to get the water as evenly distributed in the area you want to get paint and sop up any puddles. If you have puddles in your wet area, the paint will move to those areas and cause an uneven distribution of paint, which you usually don't want. Let's look more at what not to do. This first stripe that you see, I put too much puddling clear water. The next stripe, I'm going to start out right. It's got a nice glistening flat sheen, no puddles with the clear water, but then I go in with too drippy a brush, and you can see as I paint this stripe, I get too drippy blobs of paint in a couple areas of this stripe, and even when it dries, it looks kind of blotchy and the color is not evenly distributed throughout the stripe. So if you see that happen in your area that you're painting, whether it's a stripe or a petal or whatever, and you don't like it, you want to wring out your brush. So here's an example of how I squeeze out my brush, and then you can go back in and sop up whatever you don't like, whether you get a puddle of clean, clear water, or later when you drip in too much puddly paint and then it makes a blob that way, you can also suck that back up with a thirsty brush. And now I'm going to do a blended stripe. And I'm going to put purple on one end, this is Winsor Violet, and my burnt sienna on the other, and let them merge together in the center. And the water that I put down first really helps them blend seamlessly together with very little help from me. I'm just kind of pushing them together there in the middle. And now I'm going to do a gradated stripe, actually from dark to light with red. So I get a stripe wet, and then I'm going to get some M-gram Naphthol red, my very favorite red. And I'm getting it pretty thick. I'm really rubbing my brush in my red there to get cream consistency on just a damp brush. And I'm going to put the darkest red here on this end. Now I'm going to get more milk consistency red. So I'm showing you how I squeeze out my brush so that I can kind of pull this paint up into the rest of the stripe. So it goes from dark red to medium red to almost perfectly white paper. But I also want to show you how you can make a mistake and overwork these charged areas. But let's make a little mistake stripe here. But I'm getting this a little puddly, so that's the first mistake. You see the puddles, it's gonna dry uneven. I'm gonna keep filling with it. Now what if you go into this spot with a kind of drippy paint on half dry area? What you're gonna see is you're gonna get blotchy areas, and the edges are gonna develop a hard edge that you're not gonna want. So once your charged area, especially if it's a smaller finite area like this, goes half dry, if you go in with too wet a paint, or a lot of times any paint at all, once it's half dry and you try to kind of fix it by putting some more paint in or kind of messing with it and not letting it just dry, that as it dries it's going to get these sharp little edges, and it might also get blotchy. So I will show this to you after it dries as well. All right, so these are now mostly dry. You can see that this one really got those hard edges and those darker, thin little margins. This one's dry, and you can see how it created a very nice gradiated stripe. Let's look at a much more sophisticated real-world example of how I use charging to get all the subtle value changes and color changes within the zebra's muzzle. I got the whole area wet. And I'm also going to paint a couple stripes that attach to the muzzle area, making sure it is glistening but has no puddles. I'm using a silver black velvet 6 rounds so that I can get my water in exactly the spots I want it. I do start out with a bit of a puddle, but I'll push that water around and get it evenly distributed over the area I want to paint. I take great care and take my time with this stage to make sure that I don't get water where I don't want paint. Notice the muzzle goes from a brown color to a blue-black to very black in the underside of the lips. There's very soft transitions, and charging is going to help me get all these soft transitions looking very natural and realistic. So I start by dropping in some burnt sienna at the top of the muzzle with about milk consistency paint. If you've not watched my Watercolor Basics playlist, be sure to check it out. And it also includes a video explaining the difference between tea, milk, and cream consistency paint. So around the nose, there is a pretty fast transition to blue-black from this burnt sienna brown color. So I drop in some French ultramarine, and at the bottom of the lips, I use thicker cream consistency paint because that area is very dark in the reference. The thicker the paint you use, the darker the area will be. I'm also going to create a gradient in these stripes from burnt sienna to light black to dark black at the end of these stripes in this little painting session. You can see I use my brush to push the color through the stripes, but the water is really helping the paint move over the surface of the paper so I get an even natural look of both color and value as it dries. I often also use charging to create a soft atmospheric background. And in this painting, I will have soft blooms of French ultramarine that will provide a wonderful background support to this zebra. I often do backgrounds with 2 or 3 colors that bloom softly into each other. But for this zebra, I only used ultramarine blue. So first you see me using a 3/4 oval brush. This is a larger brush that can cover a lot of ground. I paint the water over the entire background where I want paint to flow, and also a bit beyond the area I want it to flow because I don't want to risk having a hard edge where the wet paint meets dry paper. And indeed, you're going to see that a hard edge still happens for me because my paper dried too fast at the margins. When that happens, I just re-wet that area in the margins and continue to extend the clean, clear water beyond where I want to paint and continue on my merry little way. Notice also I paint the clear water around the ear and use the edge of my brush and pull it along the edge of the zebra's face so I can get a clean, nice straight edge there. I then drop in some milk to cream consistency French ultramarine paint, and I can use my brush to move it around a bit too. If you would like to learn how I painted this zebra from start to finish, join my Patreon and you will get a downloadable line drawing, a reference photo, and a supply list. Also, come join my Facebook group. You can share your art, get some feedback, or give others feedback, and we have a great time. I'll link all this in the description below, so be sure to check out my description for a lot of free goodies, free tutorials, and other fun things. I will have another techniques video next week, so be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you then. Now go watercolor your world. Bye, everybody.